Hello, hello. How's everyone doing today? Welcome. We see a couple people online with us now. Some people might trickle in. Those of you who are in the chat room, Mike Kardash, I see you said hello. Feel free to drop us a note in the chat box, letting us know where you're dialing in from. As well, you'll see a little plus sign by the chat box there for later. If you wanted to ask a question, we'll get to it towards the end where we have some time carved out for Q&A. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jake. I use the pronouns he and him. I am the executive director of an organization called Next Gen Men, and one of our initiatives is Equity Leaders, where we're taking conversations around gender and masculinity and broader diversity and inclusion into workplaces. So this is part of our Equity Leaders Fireside Chat series. On the screen here, I have with me Mike Young, who I'll introduce shortly, as well as a closed captioning hack that I was taught by Sarah Saska using Google Slides. So that's what you see going on there. And we're going to jump into a conversation today about Mike's work, my work, the concept of empathy. And we're going to do that through the Equity Leaders framework. And what that is number one, we believe in diversity because it's a fact. Number two, we behave inclusively because it's an act. And number three, we become equitable as an outcome of those prior two things. And as well, just before I dive into this, we, in real world, we would be doing land acknowledgements, but it gets a little harder when I'm in Vancouver, Mike's in Toronto, folks on the chat might be all over. So what I've been doing is carving out a little bit of space for sharing an idea around indigeneity or truth and reconciliation. And today I wanted to talk about a time that just passed on the weekend. We just marked 75 years from the end of World War II. And here's a passage that I highlighted from Bob Joseph's book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. The horrors of World War II made Canadians aware of human rights and that there were people on their own soil, the very people who had contributed so much to the Allied victory, who were living in appalling conditions. And what that relates to is the fact that Indigenous men enlisted with the Canadian military to serve overseas in World War II. A big part of the Allied victory was using Indigenous languages that couldn't be cracked by, Nazis. And coming home from that, these Indigenous men still faced a lot of the discrimination, the systemic discrimination imposed upon them by the Indian Act. And it took the Holocaust for, everyday average Canadians to see those types of conditions. So I just wanted to highlight that little passage there. And then we're going to segue kind of maybe a little bit awkwardly here, but I just want to quickly introduce Mike. Mike believes in the power of productive dialogue, sharing, laughter, and honesty, and his work strives to be human and accessible above all else. And his research focuses on the intersections between gender identity, sexuality theory, racialized sexualities, hegemonic masculinity, and sexual violence. And he does this work through the Empathy Institute. And what is Mike Young's position, Empathy Institute's position on digital land acknowledgements?
So yeah, thanks first for having me. A graceful segue that you did not give yourself credit for being able to pull off. You nailed it.
It was very
yeah. Well, actually, so Jake is referencing a social media post we put out probably 2 weeks ago now. And yeah, you were the inspiration for it. Actually, I was watching another one of these fireside chats, and you carved out time at the beginning to bring awareness to a particular part of your own journey when it came to reconciliation and shared it with us, which I thought was really cool. And so my position is that we should do that more often and use that opportunity to drive reconciliation through the sharing of something we've learned or a piece of art or something that can move the needle for us and maybe help us learn something new. So in the spirit of that, I'll pitch something else into the fold of one of my favorite books, by an author. He's awesome. His name is Thompson Highway. It's called Kiss of the Fur Queen. It's a fiction novel, but it's based on a true story. And it kind of lies at the intersection of settler colonialism and sexual violence and sexuality and poverty. And it helped me learn as much as any academic book in my life has. So I really encourage people to take a look at that. Again, it's called Kiss of the Fur Queen. It's by Thomson Highway, who's a Canadian Indigenous author. Yeah, highly, highly recommend.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Welcome. So what I love, and we had a pretty long phone conversation a couple weeks ago, is even just the principle and the idea of the Empathy Institute. You know, for me, if I think about the work that we're engaged in, if we were to, you know, put it in a pot and put it on low heat and simmer it down, what would be left at the end of it is empathy, I think. And so tell me why this is the root of your work and why you switched your organization's name to the Empathy Institute.
Yeah, so making reference to something else in my past is that the Empathy Institute is only quite recently, I guess, in the life cycle of my business, what it's been called. At the beginning, back in 2017, when I started doing this work, I was doing it under the label of growth mindset, but like MY instead of MI in mindset, because those are my initials, and I guess I'm pretty vain, and I wanted to have some attachment to it. But also, it gave me the opportunity to encourage people to take accountability and pride in the things they say and the way that they act. That growth is also a very personal thing, and I think we can often put it off to, well, it's a system's fault, it's someone else's fault, someone else is going to do it. But at the end of the day, it's going to take everyone individually for themselves, thinking that this is important enough. But it kind of became clear to me towards the end of last year, transitioning into January, that growth mindset wasn't going to be my forever home for this work. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that the branding was entirely green, and it had like a little flower icon associated with it. And a ton of folks thought that I was running a cannabis startup, which happened not to be the case. I mean, it's a very popular space, but just wasn't one that I was in. And there's also a very prominent psychological theory of growth mindset by Carol Dweck, which is foundational to, I hope, what we're all trying to do, and encourage people to be better, encourage organizations to be better. But I wasn't a practitioner of that precise theory. Like it was a lens that I used, but it wasn't the thing that I actually practiced. And a lot of folks were asking specifically for that, because it would make sense that they would make that assumption. So it was getting in my way a little bit, but it really gave me the opportunity to think about what it is that I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and what I think the key is. And so empathy is, like you said, the core of it for me as well. But I think specifically when looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion work, I maybe am naive. I'm a pretty optimistic person. I think that people are generally good. I think that people generally want to be empathetic, but that there is a lack of power consciousness or awareness of how systems of discrimination operate. It's not that a lot of people don't have empathy. I think that if a child arrived at your front door and was clearly in some harm, or was in danger, or was injured in some way, I think like 100% of people would try and help them out and have empathy for that. People having empathy is not the problem. It's that we don't have awareness of how to mobilize it, because we don't understand that, yeah, disabled folks have a harder time navigating our world, or women or trans or non-binary people have a harder time even getting in the door when it comes to getting hired, that Black people are killed for going for runs, and that this is not just one-off event, that these are intertwined and connected, and a story that just keeps building on itself. So with the Empathy Institute, what I really wanted to do was to start from that place, that I think that you're good. I think the people that I'm working with, I'm coming in with that assumption. And I want to help people and to learn myself along the way how better to do that. How can I better understand your experiences, what it's like to be you, so that I can be a better version of me. And same with the organizations that I work with. You want to hire diversely and inclusively. You want to build out a workspace that is kind and compassionate. So if you're not doing that, that's not on purpose. Let's figure out how we can get you a little bit further. So that's the way that I understand these things. That's the conversation that's happening in my head. And it seems to be something that people can enter. And it seems like some folks who, I work a lot of the time with, I think folks who have a lot of privilege, and I think that's, if there is a niche that I run in, it's as a straight white dude myself, I think that I feel called to look at a bunch of other straight white dudes in the eyes and say, okay, we got to be better. And I've seen some success in people just, if you believe that I believe the best in you and that you're capable of showing empathy in different ways, and I'm on your team and not against you, I think that the response has been really encouraging. So the Empathy Institute is, I think, the forever home, hopefully, because it makes sense to me and it seems to make sense to other people. And yeah, it's just, that's the way that I frame my work.
Totally. It's a good name. And realistically, the people that are lacking empathy are sociopaths, and you know, they exist in society, but in terms of like a psychological denomination of people, it's relatively small, right? What often I find happens is as people, as individuals, we have empathy, but we sometimes build these systems and structures and cultures that are lacking in that empathy. And so how do we take that agency back and deconstruct and reconstruct is really exciting. And you know, one thing that recently caught my eye, building on your note of you know, people are generally good, you know, oftentimes when we think of, let's say, boys will be boys, right? Like Lord of the Flies, we all read that, we all watched that movie growing up, and it was upheld as this amazing standard, but it was a fictional story. But in the real life Lord of the Flies, which recently was written about in The Guardian, 6 boys got stranded on an island for 15 months, and they worked collaboratively, they took shifts, they mended a broken leg, you know. It was a beautiful flick of that, you know, fictional story. And then if you look at, you know, the original author's background and stuff like that, you start to understand that, you know, they were an alcoholic, they had kind of a dark and dour view of the world, they'd experienced some things themselves, and so that's what they wrote, right? And so you're kind of flipping that on the head and coming with, you know, a sunny ways kind of perspective and believing in the best. So I think that's powerful. Speaking of, you know, kind of approaching people and coming at a place of understanding their goodness and being on the same team, another, you know, alluding back to our prior conversation, piece that really resonated with me was when we started kind of talking about like political correctness. And I'd love if we could maybe run that conversation back.
Let's do it. Yeah. Yeah, this is, I think, something, if I'm in a room of people, particularly folks, like I did a lot of my work on post-secondary campuses, and that's where these conversations are happening quite bombastically lately is, and I mean, it happened before, during, and after Jordan Peterson being all over the media. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. But I think it's obviously a point of big contention, and I understand people not wanting to be compelled to speak in a particular way, but I think it allows us the opportunity to think about what the heck we're doing and why, and what are the values that we're looking to mobilize. I think just taking a step back to that conversation about empathy and people being generally good, I also think that it's partially that, and partially sometimes empathy just isn't the value that is highest in a particular set of choices. Like, I think that if you have a choice to empathize with someone or fulfill another need or want of yours, sometimes empathy doesn't win that battle. So I think sometimes people probably know that they're not showing empathy and have that awareness, but it's not as important yet. So I think that's another thing that we have to be mindful of is, yeah, I think that there are some people who are sociopaths and just have no capacity for empathy, and that's its own thing. And then there are people who are generally good and want to do good and be good, and we have to help them understand more about the ways that people experience the world that'll be different than their own. And then there are a lot of people in the middle who are like, yeah, empathy is important, but so is making money, but so is freedom, but so is this and so is that. And so I think another thing that we can do, and I think this conversation about political correctness can help us do it, is to name those values and in the order that we have them. So when it comes down to it, for me, a conversation about political correctness is a conversation about values and which ones you hold to be more important. So if you're defending someone's right to say anything carte blanche because you believe in someone's right to freedom or independence and not be compelled to speak in a particular way, then to me that just says that you're naming the value of freedom higher than people's right to safety, people's right to be seen in their own skin. And you also, whether you are being mindful about this or intentional about it or not, you're sending a signal to those around you that you would rather defend this right to freedom in whatever way it takes form in your brain than to see their humanity and to recognize it and to make them feel comfortable. So the way that I like to have this conversation with folks is just to say, freedom of speech for me is the freedom to choose how I want to make people feel. And making people feel good and safe and seen are like, that's my number one value. There's nothing more important to that than that to me. So every conversation I have is an opportunity to mobilize that. So I like to use the example of, this is what I explained to you on our phone call, is as someone who's had to host a lot of events when I was at university especially, and you have scripts that are given to you and you're welcoming a group of 1,000 people, welcome ladies and gentlemen is just what's written. It is the boilerplate. And I would hope that like there's no one who's going to tackle you or think you're a terrible human being if you say ladies and gentlemen. But the politically correct version of that, or the more inclusive way to say that, is to not make it gendered, because statistically I know that there's likely to be several in 1,000 people who want to identify as a lady or as a gentleman. So you can say party people, you can say esteemed guests, you can say friends and enemies. You can use any number that suits you. To me, that work is minimal. And it's an easy way to mobilize my values in a way that I don't think has anything to do with politics. I don't think it has to do with being right or correct. So I just think that the whole framing of political correctness is quite stupid. I think that that's not what it should be called, and that's not what it is. It's just, there's usually a better version of something. So if there's a better version of something that will hurt less people, why not use it if it's offered to you?
My team's gonna laugh at me if they watch the recording of this conversation, but I always got to plug this. My personal favorite that I've heard is starting talks off with "Hello, friends and enemies," because then immediately they know that they're either with you or against you.
Right. Right.
But it's kind of funny that, you know, gender is that signifier that we use. We don't really use anything visibly about other people to address them in that sense, right? Like I would never start a talk with like, "Hello, tall people and short people," right? Like it's, you know, our brains and our neuroscience and stuff like that kind of easily gravitates towards that binary thinking. And that's something that I really am fascinated by your work, is kind of that fluidity and making space for you know, how do I want to say this? Like not even buckets, right? Like if we're putting things in buckets, maybe it's fluid or whatever, but like just creating a space where everything is flowing. So do you want to talk a little bit about, you know, moving beyond that binary?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I was in school to be a grade 4 teacher for the longest time, and you're supposed to say boys and girls. When you're gathering them on the carpet, you say boys and girls. And I was just like, that's not good enough for me. And I think that, yeah, it kind of plays this larger conversation about, we feel a need to categorize people and to understand things. We like to look at something and be able to see people as little pockets of data. We like to be able to, like when you're looking at your favorite athletes, you want to know how many points per game they have, how many rebounds per game they have, did they make the All-Star team? You want to be able to look at someone and know things about them. And so we take a lot of shortcuts. And I think with gender, it's almost always unconscious. You walk by someone on the street, you're going to gender them. It's not that we want to get on people and say like, boo you for doing that. But I think that gender is a very specifically complicated thing. I think people have complicated relationships with it. As someone who is basically a sex and gender educator in a lot of the work that I do, I'm not even sure that I agree that gender should have been created in the first place. I'm not sure it did us a ton of favors. It's a socially constructed concept. It kind of takes some form of, it almost looks like it started out of biological sex and then attached some roles and some scripts to it. But the point is that we already did that. Whoever invented gender, I'd like to have a really long conversation with them as well. But it happened, and it is currently an inextricable part of how people see themselves. So to ignore that or to try and minimize that is just futile. I don't understand the energy spent on, well, I don't understand this experience of gender, so I'm not going to recognize it. I'm not going to use the language that I'm asked to, because it's not something that I grew up with or that I can understand. And I think that this whole movement to gender fluidity is just, there's now a category. There's a category that is attached to how people see themselves. And as people go on through the course of time, you're going to evolve in the terms that people are using, because people are going to be creative and to find new ways to represent themselves. Typically, and this can't account for everyone's experience, but someone will transition their gender and start using different words when they see themselves reflected more in a different term than they do in the current one they're using. So when maybe there's someone who was assigned the gender man at birth, and then they learn about the word non-binary, and then they see non-binary folks talking about their experiences and their own relationship with gender, and they go, wait, that's totally way more like I see myself than what is represented in the big burly man that I'm supposed to be, or on the other side of the ridiculous binary is that the really girly girl I'm supposed to be. I don't see myself in that as much as I see myself in this. And so as people go on and we come up with new ways to talk about and understand gender, I think we just have to brace for that. I think we just have to embrace the fact that people are creative and wonderful at being able to express themselves. And I think people really can trivialize the feeling of safety and solidarity that is attached to these terms for a lot of folks. And as a cis person, it's hard for me to fully grasp exactly the gravity of that. But it's not just like someone wants to identify in a particular way because it's fun. I mean, that might be the case, and that should also be okay. But a lot of the time it's a lifeline for people. It's like, I didn't see myself, I didn't fully understand myself until I learned this part of myself. And having people not recognize that, I can only imagine is frustrating and probably emotionally traumatic in a lot of cases.
Totally. And I think like an important thing to note through that as well too is, these gender buckets, for better or worse, challenging them and changing them on either big or small scales for ourselves doesn't necessarily mean that, we're transitioning or create some sort of big thing like that. I'm biologically cisgendered male, and but like part of the way, and we talked about this on our call as well, is like, I really want to stop codifying traits as masculine or feminine. And that doesn't mean that I myself am navigating my own gender. Like I am comfortable expressing and identifying as a male, but there's certain things like, if I love cooking, and for a long time it was like women belong in the kitchen, and men, one of my favorite memes going around right now is like, women belong in the kitchen, men belong in the kitchen, everyone belongs in the kitchen, the fridge has food, right? It's just like but like, not being codified as feminine for liking to cook and being curious about baking and those kinds of things, right? Like that's me challenging some of those constructs on a very micro level, but that doesn't mean that I am transitioning or those kinds of things. And so I think encouraging people to not conflate that, you can move beyond the binary yourself, and that you don't have to challenge your whole like identity at its core, but simply just challenge some of those traits and codifications that we fall to so easily.
Yeah, because it begins to be hard to identify where someone begins and a script that they're trying to follow ends. Like, raised as a boy, I don't know how many of the things I identify with happened organically or I felt persuaded to look into. I clearly didn't follow a ton of them in the ways that I think a lot of people had to. Like, I was a competitive dancer when I was 8 years old, and I danced like a man. Like, I was elegant and awesome, and I wasn't worried about that. But I really, like, that didn't even happen organically. Like, you had to really seek and push yourself in directions that were contrary to what you're expected to. And I think that is such an unnecessary amount of undue stress for especially kids to be trying to figure out, especially when like, what is a parent in that situation supposed to do? If like I feel myself identified with something, and then you as a parent are like, oh, you're gonna really hear it in the dressing room in the hockey if you do this, like it becomes really difficult to navigate.
But also, like, how silly is that, right? Like, if only girls dance, who the heck is going to dance with them, right? Like, you know, like, you can't just push everything into this one corner and say it's only for this one type of person. And then on the flip side of that, it's an example that I love to use. I lived in Brazil for a period of time, and I'm not the most graceful person, but you know, Brazil and Latin America has a very strong dance culture. And some women took pity on me and tried to teach me how to samba, but I was the fool who didn't know how to dance down there. But then on the flip side, you come to North America and dancing is not masculine or male, right? And so even those things that we codify as macho or male or masculine don't convey across cultures or geography.
Yeah, it's incredibly subjective, and like even if you look at like dress, through time that has changed. What we call dresses now were like every fancy dude in the world up until a particular point in time, like not only would wear that comfortably, but like was supposed to. It's a flavor of the week more than it is an actual rule, and yet we enforce it like the law. It's very confusing. It's very silly, and like stereotypes exist, and I get that, and there's a lot of truth to a lot of stereotypes, and that's okay. Stereotypes become harmful when we start to police them. So like if we have our idea of a stereotypical man in our head, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's okay. And I think there are a lot of times, you've probably seen this in your work as well. Well, what's wrong with me liking sports and girls and steak and hunting? Like, what's wrong with that? And like, there is nothing wrong with that. But when you start to look at men and boys who don't like steak, and who are vegan, like me, who maybe don't like sports, who maybe don't like girls, and all of a sudden that's like, wait, what? I don't understand that, and I start to discriminate against that, or I act out against that. That's when those stereotypes become so harmful, and they're so pervasive, and they're so silly that, I mean, you and I are sitting here trying to figure out why they still exist, but they do. And so we kind of have to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah. And I mean, we can take the word stereotype out of that sentence, plug in unconscious bias. And, you know, the way that I frame it, I remember this workshop still, you know, the implicit association test out of Harvard. No? Oh, okay. I'll have to share that with you after. I don't know the website off the top of my head, so sorry to folks on the line, but if you Google IAT Harvard, it'll come up. But I think it's actually, it's implicit.harvard.edu, and that'll take you to the site, and you can take these tests. But it's meant to measure some unconscious biases, and it's an imperfect science, obviously, but like the way that we used to have to measure biases was on a scale of 1 to 5, is STEM a career for men? And most people would be like, no, it's for everyone, but that's like our ideal selves. Anyways, moving on. So in this exercise, this woman said, you know, I have a strong bias with women in family and men in career. And like my mom was a stay-at-home mom. I was a stay-at-home mom when my kids were young, and that works just fine for me. And so unconscious bias carries this like negative connotation. And I said, that's great that works great for you. The only time that these unconscious biases become problematic is when you use that as a measuring stick for other people. When you start saying that everyone should have a stronger connotation with women in family and men in work, right? And that hurts women who you know, are trying to have families and going in the workplace, and it hurts men who want to be more involved in family caregiving and trying to thrive in a workplace as well too. So to your point, you know, stereotypes exist for a reason. There's a lot of history and culture and storytelling baked into those to help us understand the world that we live in, but they become really poor measuring sticks when we apply them to others.
Yeah, and like the term unconscious bias, I mean, obviously we focus on the term bias, but I think the the main takeaway is unconscious for me. Like, we can't just even sit here and say, like, even to quote myself from 3 minutes ago, that there's nothing inherently wrong with stereotypes. In an ideal world, that would be true, but because they're so unconscious and those biases and stereotypes get mobilized without us knowing, they're inevitably going to become harmful in our lives if we're not like hyper aware and checking ourselves at every second. And even I would count myself among these people, and probably you as well. I'm going to struggle with that my whole life. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to have unchecked biases that are going to affect my decision making, my actions. The point is not to be perfect, obviously, in that way, but to identify that these biases and these stereotypes exist, work in our lives and our relationships to try and break them down, and just be critical and aware and thoughtful of where we're at, what space we're in, who's around us, and how these things might be impacting other people. You might have heard my dog just run behind me there. So.
It's all good. That's part of, you know, us working from home is the human piece, right? Where pets and our kids and all that stuff are part of it.
Most people want me to get out of the picture so they can look at her instead, but you're stuck with me.
Put her up to the camera. But yeah, I mean, and these unconscious biases, again, like bias sounds like a bad thing, but you know, they can be positive as well too. You know, before the call here, you and I were sitting and talking about some of the privileges that we exist, right? And so some of these things can be biases in and around our privileges. For example, you know, I'm tall, I'm 6'8", I'm white, I look male and masculine and those kinds of things, and that buys me a lot of social credibility in a lot of spaces, right? Mm-hmm. I often find myself on stages just because I'm, you know, a tall white guy with an opinion, and there's people of color and women with PhDs, and you know, that doesn't diminish my own you know, intelligence or contribution or anything like that, but you know, oftentimes individuals who don't have the same privileges that I do have to work, you know, thrice as hard and overcome barriers to get to that same stage. And you know, I think you know, for better or worse, sometimes when you know, people look at guys like us, you know, they can see some of those outward privileges that we have, and even some of those hidden ones. And I think, you know, we were jokingly listing, you know, racial privilege, height privilege, and education privilege.
You're alone on the height privilege, unfortunately.
5'20". Does that help if I rephrase it that way?
Yeah, thank you.
You know, all of these things, and sometimes, like, and I'm not taking this as like a personal affront or whatever, there's reasons for this, but we get written off. Like, what are we doing in this space? How can we care about it? Those kinds of things. So what say you to that?
Yeah, it is the, I for my own money, is the $1 million question in the equity space right now, is just how involved, just to use race as a really easy example, how involved do we want white people to be? And I think that depending on who you ask, there are just a wide range of extremely passionately held ideas about what the obvious answer to that question is. And I think that there are a lot of contradictions, and I think that there's a reason for that. I'm not even saying that these contradictions are ridiculous or silly. I think I understand where they come from. But on the one hand, just my own politics, I would prefer any educational programs about racism to be run and developed by people of color. I would like any programs about gender and sexual diversity to be run by people who consider themselves to be gender diverse or to be of a queer sexual orientation. But at the same time, on the other hand, a lot of the time when we're saying that these things need to be run by these people, and we need to be holding space and maintaining space for these people, we ask, well, where are the white people? Why is this falling to us? When it comes to sexism, where are the men? Why aren't they stepping up? Why is this always falling to women or gender diverse people? And so I think that we need to find a balance. I think we need to figure out what are the roles for folks of privilege within systems of oppression to be leaders. Because, I mean, if you're living like I am in a lot of ways, in this really sturdy fortress of, let's just use white privilege, is it a wise thing for me to just rely on people of color to try and break in when I can do twice the work from the inside to make that fortress easier to break into, or to weaken it, or to break it down altogether? I think that privilege is a double-edged sword. I think that when it goes unchecked, that's how discrimination and oppression happens. That's how diversity evaporates within an office setting without realizing it. But the other side of that is that you and I can go into spaces that a lot of folks who experience oppression can't. And what we do with that is the point. I think if you get into a room of people that look and think a lot like people like you and I often look and think, and you're not making space for the voices and the lessons that you've learned from folks who experience those forms of oppression. Like, just looking at my own story, like the Empathy Institute ideal is just me right now. I mean, there are some really wonderful folks who help me with some like technical things and some illustrations and stuff. But when it comes to the organization, this is it. The ideal is to have a bunch of people, like I said, who will be running programs that are related to their lived experiences. How is that supposed to happen? In the meantime, I have to take the opportunities that are ahead of me, and I have to be trying to bring folks along with me. I'm doing a session on Friday for women in entrepreneurship, and one of my old classmates, who happens to be a woman of color, is going to be co-facilitating with me. There are opportunities there to kind of share space and to share the platform, and to try and leverage it. And I think that's the point. But you're going to run into folks, and I have, and you probably will as well, who just think that we don't belong in the space. And I think my organization is called the Empathy Institute. I feel called to empathize with why that must be. And that's not to say, I think that we are called to be humble enough to understand that's not about us. That's about people who have had lifetimes of lived experience, and it comes out often as anger, which is valid, comes out in frustration or sadness, or even in mourning, that people like you and I are speaking on particular issues that they've spent their whole lives living and breathing. It can be frustrating and I'm sure upsetting. And I think that it's on us to try and listen and to bring those people in and to learn from them, and to hopefully be able to find some bridges to collaborate. Because if white people, if men, if all of these people who hold all of these privileges in our world play second fiddle or stand back and wait, I don't think in my lifetime these systems of discrimination are going to be defeated, but it's going to be 3, 4, 5, 6 times as long as we just wait in the background. So I think that's a question that the folks in our industry have to think about and to ask each other and to talk more about, because we don't have a clear answer. And I think that folks like you and I often get mixed messages simultaneously. Why are you here, and why don't you show up? It's like, oh, I can't do both. And so
1 foot in and 1 foot out. I don't know.
Yeah, and to be honest, like it leads to an existential crisis I have almost once a month, where I'm just like I feel uneasy being here. Like, there was one time I went in to do a talk at the Ottawa Hospital to a department about producing basically how to do care for gender diverse patients that is accessible and inclusive. And I had set up to have a trans person come with me. I'd put out a call, and they had responded to it and said they were interested in sharing their experiences if folks had questions. So the ideal would be for me to teach the kind of theoretical stuff that I know like the back of my hand, and to have this person be able to speak to what those experiences are actually like. And they backed out of me in the last second. So I went by myself. And so I was doing this 45-minute lecture to a group full of doctors as a cis person about creating an accessible and inclusive space for gender diverse people. And I think I did a dope job, and then I felt like shit because I was like, oh, like, this is such a complicated world to navigate. And quite frankly, I'm thankful for that discomfort. I think that it keeps me on my toes and keeps me sharp, and hopefully will lead to less mistakes and hopefully lead to more opportunities being made for other people. But yeah, it's not been clear to me. And if you have a clear answer on it, I'm all ears. But I think that we have a lot of mixed messages, and I think we need to encourage people who have privilege to do something with it.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have an answer. I have an opinion. I think there's certain things that when we stereotype one way or another, other people. So, people could look at someone like me or someone like you and be like, oh, well, what does that, cis white guy know, right? And it kind of writes off our lived experiences and starts treating us like a monolith, and we don't want to do that with other people either. I don't want to use the term, diversity of thought, because I think that that's sometimes a bit of a cop out that like privileged spaces use to kind of get around representation. Mm-hmm. But on a flip side of that, like very few people know looking at me that, myself and my parents came to Canada as refugee immigrants, right? And so I love when I'm in a space with white people and they talk about these damn immigrants. And then I say, tell me more, right? Because like that's like an invisible identity that I have. And, my born name is Jakub Stika and I go by Jake Stika, right? Like, and then it registers for people, oh, a white guy had to anglicize his name as well too. And so, if I just by looks am written out of the conversation, I can't bring that perspective. I can't bring other people along that journey that I went along as well too. And so I think we need to be very careful. I think absolutely, I work primarily in a gendered space. And so trans, non-binary, women, like there's a gender gap in regular spaces, and there's probably a gender gap in these spaces. Need to be cognizant of sharing that journey with others and leveraging my platform to be kind of, the tip of the spear and create space for others where they may not have been otherwise. But, for me, I grew up in jock culture. I very much participated and obviously continue to participate in patriarchy because that's the overarching system. Like I love when, people are anti-patriarchal, but because it's the system that we exist in, we're all participants. It's the same as, democracy. We live in Canada, we participate in democracy because that's a system we exist in. Capitalism as well too, right? And so how do we transform those systems from within? I think is a really important question.
Yeah, it's hard, and I rarely will talk about it or incorporate it into my work because I think that it's a complicated thing to do. But like I struggle with chronic illness. I've lived in poverty for the last 4 years. I've struggled with mental illness and addictions in my own life and in people close to me, and feel very connected to a lot of the conversations that I'm having in ways that are hard to illustrate without feeling like I'm erasing other people. And so it's not, I think, the nicest reality in the world, but the way that I see it, for better or for worse. And I think there's probably some folks, maybe even you, who might even disagree with it, but I just kind of think that that's my give and take. I think when it comes to being a white person in the space, I don't have to deal with racism. I don't have to deal with sexism. I'm much less likely, though I have experienced it, to experience sexual violence, and this, that, and the next thing. And the flip side of that is that sometimes I'm going to feel like what I have gone through is minimized. So that's the trade-off for me. And I think that I still get the best end of that deal. And if I feel like folks don't get that or are making assumptions about me, I'm happy to try and fill in those blanks. And I think that people will often surprise you. And I think that's just the way that I conduct myself in my life. Is I'm curious, and I figure I probably don't know someone's story, because again, that's just formed by my own experiences of having so many times on the other end of that being like, if only you knew exactly what I'm thinking or what I've gone through to kind of come to this place here today. So yeah, it's super complicated, and I'm not really sure how to work around that, because again, I think I make concessions that I don't fully feel comfortable with. But even when Donald Trump is elected, I remember, very similar to your statement of participating in patriarchy, I wrote this like big, long, emotional Facebook status because I don't take up enough space in the world, and talked about how like I am patriarchy, I am white supremacy, I am sexism, understanding that like even as someone who is anti all of these things, I am a representation of white supremacy. I'm a representation of patriarchy. I'm a representation of all of these systems of oppression. And so I better be damn sure that on a daily basis, I'm actively trying to break them down, because again, that awareness is the first step to understanding that it needs that we all are complicit and play a role.
Yeah. And I think the key word there is actively, right? Like, we created a side project called Antisexist Social Club with some partners out.
Dope shirt.
Exactly. With some folks in New York City who run Gen Equality. And the principle of that is it's not enough to not be sexist. We have to be anti-sexist, right? And so it's translating that, well, I don't participate in those kinds of things into like, I don't want those things to happen to anyone. But looking at time here, we don't have any questions. So if anyone online does want to throw one our way, we'll carve out some time for that. But just out of my back pocket here, we're doing these conversations during the time of coronavirus, and I'm always curious with people in these conversations, what do you think will never be the same after this, and what lessons do you hope we keep?
It's a great question. I was stoked that you had that in your pocket because I think it's a conversation everyone should be having. I have a wish list for sure. I'm hoping that people like on the highest level will just come out of this a little bit more patient and kind with each other. I think that we've been made to be flexible with our timelines, with our demands, especially as leaders in organizations, understanding that things are going to take extra time, understanding that people are balancing so much. And it seems like when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, we think that like raising kids and having pets and having members of our family who are ill or whatever it is that we might be going through, if you're at the office, those things don't affect you in the same way. And yeah, like if you're at home all the time or you're working around these things, it can feel more intense. But I think that understanding that work is a part of life and not the entirety of it is a huge, huge hopeful takeaway that hopefully will make companies more flexible when it comes to what does a job look like. Do you have to be in the office from 8:30 to 4:30 Monday through Friday, or can you determine what's best for you? I think that my big thing right now, and I started thinking about this from the perspective of hiring, but it's kind of gone beyond that, is just trying to encourage and equip organizations for flexibility. You are different than I am, and what I'm going to need on a particular day or in a particular role when it comes to support is going to be so much different than you, which is going to be different from the person beside you. So to even say a job is a one size fits all, I think is just, it's not possible to determine what that is. So yeah, I hope people are in situations after this where organizations are going to probably move at a glacial pace, and it's going to be a while before we see this maybe in the perfect situation. But remote working will be more normalized. People will still have access to offices if they want to be there. I think that there are a lot of folks who need structure to thrive, and I think that that's great too. And I think hopefully people can remain supported through that. But yeah, I hope we just kind of blow up the idea of what it means to have a job, to do a job, and that we're able to also, primarily thinking of parents and guardians and teachers, just appreciate people who do really tough ass work on a daily basis. I know a lot of parents and guardians have been at home trying to help their kids learn, and their opinion of and respect for teachers has skyrocketed. It's not easy to do a lot of these things, and I think people who maybe live their lives outside of the home are seeing things a little bit differently and hopefully sharing chores and domestic labor a little bit more fairly. So those are just some of the things. I know that there's a bunch, but I'd be interested to hear if you had any on your mind.
I'm keeping that question usually for people on the line, but I do want to just quickly, before we jump off here, we did get a question from Mike Kardash. So much to think about. I often question the idea of thinking inside or outside the box. What if we start at there are no boxes and let the conversation flow from there? What do you think about that?
Fellow Mike, I'm here with you every step of that way. But I think being just practical, again, just looking at gender and the boxes that exist, I don't think we can undo that. I think I've had a lot of conversations with folks. I've been teaching about gender and sexual diversity for 7-8 years now, starting at university and helping with the program there. And I've been asked no fewer than 100 times, why do we have so many boxes to help people feel like they don't fit into a particular box? And I'm like, you're right, you got me, aha moment, take it to the bank and cash it in. But at the same time, we do have boxes, and I think that there is value for people, whether I can understand it or not, because I don't rely on boxes in the same way. That if someone maybe is a two-spirit person and they find safety and comfort and security in that box, to take it away is to remove that safety net. And they might be relying on it in a way that I maybe can't relate to. And I think to take away the boxes entirely, I want to build systems without boxes, but the systems that already agree with boxes that are lifelines for people, I think we have to adapt. And it's annoying, and it's a lot of work for a lot of folks to learn about all the ways people identify when it comes to gender and all the different sexual orientations that exist. But yeah, I think to talk about sexuality and gender and just our expectations of folks without codification, without categories, is dope. I think that's the best. I think that's the way to do it. But I think when it comes to structurally how we're set up, I just think we have to make lemonade and understand that these boxes exist, and to support people's journey in navigating them and finding ones that suit them. Because I think that can be a huge thing. And I've been all over this question in the past, but I think I've landed pretty securely in not loving that they exist, but loving that people are finding security in them and trying to support people along that journey.
Totally. And I think like where the boxes become limiting when you say all aspects of you need to fit in this one box, as you say that it exists in this one. And if I can play with it a little bit on my own as well too, what it's bringing up for me is this idea when people say, oh, well, I don't see race or I don't see gender, right? And that's also really limiting, because you're essentially denying that person their lived experience. Not, again, to say that, you know, the monolith of you're a white person, you experience this, or you're a man, you experience this is right either. But, you know, there isn't this zero sum where all of a sudden we've arrived and we can just say, oh, strip all those things and you can just be a person. There's a lot of stuff that we're still deconstructing and reconstructing in a healthy way. So that would be my contribution to that question. We are slightly over time. Usually I try and promise people 45 minutes. So Mike, to let everyone go, where can people find you and the Empathy Institute?
Yeah, so I'm at empathyinstitute.org. You can drop the, but if you just Google Empathy Institute, my hope is that I've done SEO well enough that you'll find it. But generally across social media, it's at the Empathy Inst, because it was one character over what you're allowed on Twitter, I believe. So I had to change everything. So that's where you can find me, posting stuff pretty regularly. And the way that we try and structure content is to do a few kind of mini essays every week on social media about different social issues. And if there's ever something that people are thinking about or want us to be thinking about, we're always looking for new conversations to have, and hopefully we'll be able to engage with some folks of it as we move through this wild, crazy time together.
Super. And you can check out Equity Leaders on LinkedIn and at equityleader.org on Twitter. And then, yeah, we're going to let you go. And for anyone who wants to tune in for future Fireside Chats, we'll be doing another one next Wednesday. So thanks for tuning in, Mike, Ben, Darren, Leah, and for anyone who watches this recording after, we'll see you in real life or online. Ciao.